So I think we might make a start now because the attendees hasn't changed for a few minutes. So welcome to the EGA Virtual Autumn Panel Discussion. This is our first time ever doing an event like this virtually, so it's a learning experience for all of us. And I would really very much like to thank our panelists for agreeing to come along and do the event in this way. So this evening's event is the future of the pharmaceutical and biopharmaceutical industry in Ireland, and it's been organised by Professor Stephen Ferguson from UCD Engineering, from the School of Chemical and Bioprocess Engineering here, and he has invited our speakers and panelists along. I'm just going to very briefly give you the names of our panelists now, but later on I'll introduce each of them more fully. So we have Matt Moran, who is from IBAC and Biopharmachem Ireland. We also have Professor Niall Barron from UCD and NIBRT, Professor Anne-Marie Healey from Trinity College, and also an adjunct professor here in UCD. And we've got Professor Stephen Ferguson, who, as I said already, is from UCD here. So just a few pointers before we start out and tips for what the evening is going to be like. Each of our panelists is going to talk for a few minutes, and you'll see that panelist and their slides while they're speaking. And at the end, we're going to have a question and answer session. But if you hover your arrow or your cursor over the bottom of your screen in front of you, you should see two little speech bubbles with Q&A written underneath that. So what we'd ask you to do is, while you're listening, or if you have any questions, to start to write the questions into that, and at the very end we'll come back and I'll bring those questions to the panelists. So what would be very useful for us is if you identify yourself when you write down the question, and also if you could identify to whom the question is directed, so that we can make sure that the right person is answering that question. There's also a chat function available if you want to talk to other participants, but if you want to ask questions and answers for the end, we just ask that you do put them into that Q&A session. I'm also conscious that I forgot to introduce myself at the very start, so you're probably wondering who's been speaking to you for the last couple of minutes. My name is Aoife Ahern, and I'm the College Principal and Dean of Engineering in UCD, so I'm very happy to welcome you to this. It's unfortunate that it can't be on campus in UCD, but hopefully we'll still have a very engaging and interesting event and evening. So without me speaking for too much longer, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. So our first speaker is Matt Moran. And Matt is Director of Biopharmachem Ireland and also from IBAC. And since 1994, he's acted as the Director of Biopharmachem Ireland, representing the interests of the biopharmachem sector in Ireland. He's also a member of the European Chemical Industry Council, a board member of Active Pharmaceuticals Ingredients, Committee of CEFIC, which represents the European API industry, a board member of the European Association for Bioindustries, which represents the European biotech sector, and chair of the National Associations Council. He has a BSc from Trinity College Dublin and a diploma in chemical engineering from UCD and an MBA in business administration and management from UCD. And today he's going to give us an overview of why the importance of this sector to Ireland. So I'm going to pass on to Matt and allow him to speak to you now.
Thanks for your very kind introduction, Aoife. I'm delighted to be here and hope that you find the next couple of minutes interesting. I have a couple of slides, so maybe I might ask for the first slide just to be popped up on the screen now. Okay, so I'm very quickly going to give you an overview of why this is such an important sector for the Irish economy. And I think if you're listening to any of the recent news reports on television or even in newspapers, you'll hear how, I suppose, the value that this industry has to the Irish economy actually has helped to mitigate some of the more severe impacts that we could have seen happen to our GDP over the last number of months as a result of the unfortunate COVID-19 pandemic. The numbers up on the screen there give you an idea of the size and scope of the industry. And in fact, even since I put this slide together, it's grown again. And at the moment, the exports from what we call the biopharma industry, which includes pharmaceutical products, active pharmaceutical ingredients, so on and so forth, is just shy of 80 billion euros. And if you add on the rest of the chemical industry to that, you come with a number which is not too far south of 100 billion euros. So that gives you an idea of the sheer value of this sector as an exporting sector. And in fact, over 60% of all the goods that leave this country come from this sector. So it's very important. There's around about 75 biopharmaceutical companies in Ireland. They tend to be dominated by multinational companies, but recently we have seen the emergence of some interesting companies on the indigenous side, and you probably read about the recent purchase of Inflazone by Roche, which was an example of a company spinning out of Trinity from Luke O'Neill's lab in Trinity College, which was a great success story for the country and for, I think, Irish research. The industry started out back in the late 1960s and started out as being, I suppose, basically a chemical-based industry where active pharmaceutical ingredients were made in traditional organic synthesis plants. This moved to what we call drug formulation manufacture in the, I suppose, 80s and 90s. And then at the turn of the century, we saw the emergence of the biotech or the biologic industry, which mainly is involved in the manufacture of monoclonal antibodies. And this is where the growth really is at the moment. And if we look at some of the investment that's gone into the industry, about 10 billion euros have been invested in the last 10 years, mainly in large molecule manufacturing sites. So companies like Alexion, Regeneron, Bristol Myers Squibb, Pfizer, Eli Lilly, so on and so forth, have invested a significant amount of money in the country. So that's a great, I think, vote of confidence for Ireland and a vote of confidence for the success, the continued success of the industry here. And we see also on the slide that just short of 2 billion euros have been invested in process development and manufacturing. Next slide, please. The IGA will proudly tell you that the top 10 biopharmaceutical companies in the world all have centres of manufacturing or development in Ireland. That changes a bit because this industry, as you know, is prone to quite a lot of merger and acquisition activity. So sometimes it's 9 out of the top 10. At the moment, I think it's 10 out of the top 10. We employ over 30,000 people directly. That's growing at the moment, and probably the same number indirectly. So that's an employment impact of over 60,000 people. The reason the industry is so successful here, I think, is because the facilities really specialize in manufacturing excellence, both on the drug product and drug substance side, and have a very important role as being global sourcing locations, mainly within large multinationals. And their track record is second to none. This is backed up by an extraordinary compliance and regulatory track record, which is supported by a very strong regulator through the HPRA. And this is important for attracting new investment into the country, because as you know, a highly regulated sector and a sector which cannot afford quality problems. Next slide. So finally, the final slide, which is why is the industry so successful here? An industry which has grown quite recently. Tax is very important. Low levels of corporation tax are a major attractor for all foreign direct investment, not just for biopharmaceuticals. People here are second to none. We rely on an excellent education system and a very strong system of training and development, which takes place within companies. As I've said already, our track record is second to none. And we see more and more companies developing in the supply chain space. And recently we've seen the evolution of what we call global business service centers. And these are employing significant numbers in central functions such as supply chain management, management of patient information, regulatory affairs, so on and so forth. And obviously, as we look to the future, we think that it's important that industry seeks to collaborate more with the academic sector on the research side, and that we look to build into new areas of activities such as in the advanced therapeutics or cell and gene therapies. And obviously, to finish off, regulatory stability remains one of the cornerstones or the foundations of the success of the industry here. And that's really about all I have to say, Aoife. I hope that gives you a flavour of how important a sector this is to the country.
Thank you, Matt. I think that was very useful, and in particular gives us the context for some of the other people who are going to speak to us now. So we'll come back to Matt at the end. So if you have any questions for him, do remember to put them into that Q&A box as well. So we're going to move on to our second speaker now, who is Professor Niall Barron. And just while Niall switches on his camera, I'll introduce him to you. So Niall is a professor of biochemical engineering at UCD School of Chemical and Bioprocess Engineering, but he's also principal investigator at the National Institute for Bioprocessing Research and Training, or NIBRT. Niall obtained a BA in microbiology from Trinity College Dublin and a PhD in applied microbiology biochemistry from the University of Ulster in 1997, then going on to spend 3 years at Baylor College of Medicine in Dr. Bert O'Malley's lab as a postdoctoral scientist working on genome engineering strategies to study nuclear steroid receptor function. He then returned to Ireland to work with Professor Martin Kleins on stem cell engineering at the National Cell and Tissue Cell Culture Centre in DCU, and subsequently as a senior scientist in the National Institute for Cellular Biotechnology. He was instrumental in growing the mammalian cell engineering group with a specific focus on production of recombinant therapeutic proteins. He's really testing me with his bio, actually. Thank you, Niall. And he was director of NICB from 2015 to 2017 and a member of academic staff in the School of Biotechnology in DCU. And as I said, he is now a professor with us at UCD and has been since 2017, and also a principal investigator in NIBRT. And Niall is going to talk to us about the sector moving to new platforms and manufacturing of new therapies, I think, as well. Thank you, Niall.
Great, thanks, Aoife. And while I apologise to you for that terribly long bio, I thought I'd sent a shorter one. I'll just try and share my screen. So can everybody see? Yeah, maybe someone can let me know.
Yes, we can see. Yeah, it's perfect. Yeah.
Thanks, Aoife. So good evening, everyone. Nice to be speaking to you this evening. I think Matt set the scene nicely there for kind of what I'm about to tell you. So as Aoife mentioned, I'm not just a professor in UCD, but also involved in research, the research part of NIBRT, which I'll assume most of you are familiar with. It's on UCD campus. It's an IDA facility which is set up to train people for the sector that Matt's just described, and also to perform research in particularly into the manufacturing and analytics of recombinant proteins historically. But as we go forward, I hope I can show you today that we're now starting to focus in on these newer modalities. So just a bit of terminology and some explanations for the audience first. ATMPs, or advanced therapy medicinal products, is kind of the umbrella term for these newer modalities, often sort of colloquially referred to as cell and gene therapies, but also includes things like regenerative medicine and tissue engineering. So by way of kind of comparison to maybe sort of existing modalities or older modalities, small molecules you could look upon as kind of first generation medicines, and both first and second generation medicines will continue to be, you know, the bedrock of the medicinal capability that the physicians have to treat disease. There is now this new generation of therapies which essentially encompasses really a whole swathe of different technologies, which is fantastic. But in the context of what we're here to discuss today, it also presents lots of different challenges for those of us trying to manufacture them. We believe that, you know, there is a huge opportunity for Ireland in this space, though, given the track record that we have, and I'll come back to that. So very briefly, just to kind of explain to those of you who are not familiar with cell and gene therapy, rather than in many cases treating a disease, often cell and gene therapies are provision of a cure, and that's one of the most exciting elements of them. However, as I say, some of the challenges are really related to their manufacture, and it's well recognized that there's a bigger focus now on the manufacturing aspects of these and challenges that need to be solved to ensure that they're affordable and safe to go into patients. So you'll see down here on the bottom right, like an analogy I use when I teach second year engineering students in UCD as to, you know, what these modalities actually entail. If you look at small molecules, they're equivalent to kind of a bicycle in terms of complexity, whereas as you move up through the complexities of these different medicines, generation 1 up to kind of generation 3 here, you're kind of advancing through much more challenging and component, you know, entities with much more component parts. So I'll just use one of these therapies as an example to kind of illustrate, I guess, the complexity that we're talking about here, certainly compared to the production of small molecules and recombinant proteins, not diminishing some of the challenges that remain for those types of medicines. But if we think of something like CAR T therapy, which many of you will have heard of, it's, you know, unbelievable results in terms of treatments and indeed curing some of the blood cancers. So in CAR T therapy, we essentially take these immune cells from a patient, T cells. They have to then be modified external to the patient That involves usually using a virus. Lentivirus is a particular type of virus that's very successful at getting into these types of immune cells. Those viruses have to be made as a medicine in their own right under GMP conditions. And the components to make those viruses, the plasmids that we use to manufacture those viruses, they also have to be manufactured under GMP conditions. So you're layering lots of different technologies on top of each other in order to get to a particular type of modality. So once those viruses are made, they're used to infect the patient's T cells. This is typically done remotely at a specialist facility. Could be quite some distance from the patient. It could be more localized if they're in one of the big global hospitals that specialize in these therapies. And after a fairly convoluted expansion and activation procedure, those modified cells can go back into the patients where they're now able to see the cancer that they couldn't previously see until they were modified. So that's really just a quick example of kind of the type of complexity we're talking about in these modalities. Moving on to the kind of commercial opportunity here, again, it's something that most of us have heard about in the paper, or in the news at least, and media. There's a lot of excitement around these therapies for obvious reasons. You know, we have in Ireland already, I'm delighted to say, we have companies like Takeda making cell therapies. More recently, we have a smaller company from the UK called Mira GTX, who will be setting up a plasmid and virus manufacturing site in Shannon, which will be for gene therapy specifically, where you're replacing a gene that's broken in a patient. So a disease like hemophilia, for instance, there's some very exciting results coming out in that space. But you can see here from a commercial perspective, there's an awful lot of interest in this area and lots of activity that you know, every projection says is exponential over the next kind of 5 to 10 years. And again, all the big companies that Matt mentioned are interested and involved in acquisitions in this area, as well as a lot of kind of newer companies that are very much innovators and bringing new technologies to the market. So in terms of the Irish context then, so in NIBRT, we've spent the last kind of 18 months bringing together all the different stakeholders within the Irish context, big multinationals, smaller companies within Ireland, the funders, consultancies, government agencies, and so on, really to kind of look at this opportunity and make the case to government that we should be supporting all the different elements that any jurisdiction needs to have to attract that kind of investment into Ireland. We believe we're starting at a high position again, you know, harking back to Matt's description of what Ireland's achieved so far. The manufacturing base here, I think, is primed to be able to bring these processes in, but we can't be complacent about it. We need to put the supports in to convince them that we have the right kind of skill sets here, that we have the engineers, the scientists, the operators that will be able to go into these new facilities and overcome the kind of challenges in manufacturing that I described earlier on. So just to finish, really by way of kind of conclusions, I think this represents a really amazing opportunity for new FDI into Ireland, as well as copper fastening the FDI that's already occurred over the last 10 or 15 years to make sure that we're future proof in terms of these modalities coming to Ireland for manufacturing. There's lots of competition out there, so we can't be complacent, as I said. And I think if we look at other jurisdictions in terms of that complacency, the excitement is genuinely there, and you know, I think there's this huge opportunity for us to build on the success we've had so far and you know, attract this investment to Ireland in the future. And I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Niall. So I can see already there are some questions coming in, which we'll deal with at the end. So if you continue on putting in your questions there, that will make our discussions more interesting at the end. And thank you to those who put questions in so far. So we're going to move on to our next speaker now, after Niall, and that is Professor Anne-Marie Healey. So Professor Healey is a professor in pharmaceutics and pharmaceutical technology in the School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences at Trinity College Dublin. She has a BSc in pharmacy and a PhD in pharmaceutics, both from Trinity. She joined the School of Pharmacy in Trinity in 1992 as a lecturer, and in 2010 she was elected a Fellow of Trinity College. She has over 70 peer-reviewed publications and given over 100 presentations at national and international conferences, graduating 15 PhD students and mentoring 15 postdoctoral researchers. Her research interests include pharmaceutical material science, pre-formulation and formulation of pharmaceuticals, amorphous solids, co-crystals, etc. Marie, there's quite a long list there.
That's fine.
And she's currently co-principal investigator of the Synthesis and Solid State Pharmaceutical Centre and a funded investigator in the Advanced Materials and Bioengineering Research Centre, and was awarded a special visiting research fellowship by CNPq in 2014 to further research with the Faculty of Pharmacy at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And as I said, she's also an adjunct professor here in UCD. And I think, Anne-Marie, you are going to talk about the future of pharmaceuticals and drug delivery, and maybe more of the interactions with patients a little bit more than our engineers do as well. Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Okay, let me see. So hopefully you can see my screen okay?
Yes, we can. Yes,
Yep.
it's perfect.
Okay. So thank you, Aoife, for that introduction, and I'm delighted to be here. And as Aoife said, I'm going to focus more so on the small molecule area, so a little bit different from Niall's presentation. But as Niall said, you know, small molecules haven't gone anywhere. They're here and here to stay. And so what I'm going to try and focus on in this short presentation is just some of the areas where I see exciting opportunities for developments and innovations in formulation and drug delivery of particularly small molecules. So, you know, as we know, in this increasingly competitive commercial sector that is the pharmaceutical industry, innovation is important. And innovation in drug delivery and in drug delivery and formulation is important, not just in terms of product life cycle management and differentiation for new products, but also in terms of responding to patient needs and improving patient therapies and ultimately patient outcomes. And so with the diversity and range of different routes of administration for formulations and drug delivery systems, we have a wealth of opportunity to engage and to develop a diverse range of formulations or drug delivery platforms that we can use for the new chemical entities that are coming through, and also for existing older drugs, perhaps to improve the therapies for patients. So what I've listed here is just what I feel are the current, perhaps hot topics in terms of pharmaceutical formulation and drug delivery. And I've highlighted three, not for any particular reason, except I find them interesting, and I'm not going to have time to go through all of these. So the three I've pulled out are what are called enabling formulations to improve the bioavailability of poorly water-soluble drugs, drug device combinations, and what's referred to as the Internet of Medical Things, and then personalized and age-appropriate medicines, and in particular the potential for the application of 3D printing to generate personalized and or age-appropriate medicines. So, you know, poorly soluble drugs takes up a lot of energy of formulation scientists in the industry. And why so? Well, it's because, you know, most estimates would tell you that between 70 and 80% of new chemical entities that are coming through drug discovery programs have issues with their solubility. They're poorly soluble. What that means in terms of oral drug delivery is not enough drug will dissolve in the gastrointestinal tract. If the drug doesn't dissolve, it can't be absorbed. And if it can't be absorbed, you don't get a pharmacological effect. So you don't get a therapeutic effect. So there's an ongoing task for formulation scientists to develop better enabling formulations which will improve the API solubility. And in fact, there has been a lot of success in this area. You know, drugs that perhaps would have been abandoned previously have succeeded in being brought to market through these types of formulation approaches. But what I would say is, these developments shouldn't allow us to let the chemists off the hook, and there is a question there as to whether, because the formulators have been so successful, have they kind of allowed for poorer development of drugs, poorer drug design at the earlier stage, because, well, the chemists think, well, the formulation scientists will sort this out for me eventually anyway. Anyway, that's maybe a little unfair to the chemists, but I'll leave that thought with you. Then in terms of connected medical devices, and I guess this is increasingly important in terms of drug delivery, is the development of combination products, drug delivery, medicinal product combinations. And so connected medical devices where we can harness data that's personal to a patient has huge potential opportunities across various parts of the healthcare system, from primary care to secondary care and so on, but also in terms of drug delivery. And so harnessing a patient's data to optimize their therapies and to optimize drug delivery is hugely exciting. And I've presented here on this slide just some examples of where we're seeing this come into play in terms of things like, smart continuous glucose monitoring for diabetics, smart insulin pens, connected inhalers, asthma monitoring, ingestible sensors, and so on. And so the idea here is, you capture the patient's data, and using that data, then you feed back to the device or to the drug delivery system, and you tailor the therapy then to the needs of the patient at that particular time. And so an example of where this kind of development has been seen is already in the parenteral drug delivery innovation curve for insulin, for example, where we started off with this really simple product, insulin vials and needles and syringes. And then we had the innovation of the insulin pen, which obviously was a much more patient-friendly approach and improved patient adherence and compliance to their medication. And now we're seeing these connected products, these smart pens, where the pen can capture information about the time the insulin dose is given, the dose that's given, the type of insulin that's given. And using that data, then potentially a clinician can fine-tune the therapy for the patient. And so ultimately, I suppose the objective is that we enable patients to take more ownership and more responsibility for the management of their own conditions. And we have a more patient-centric approach to formulation development, to drug delivery, and to patient care and treatment. And this patient-centric approach, this patient-centered approach, is to be seen also in developments in the area of personalized medicine, where we're moving away from this idea of one size fits all to trying to, again, tailor the product or tailor the therapy or tailor the formulation to the needs of either an individual patient or a group of like patients. And in this space, a lot of people would see huge opportunities for 3D printing or additive manufacturing. And I know Stephen is going to come later and talk about additive manufacturing in the context of designing and manufacturing equipment or facilities, but there's also opportunities, I think, for the use of 3D printing in the manufacture of medicinal products, drug products. So the first 3D printed tablet was approved by the FDA in 2015. It's a drug that's used to treat epilepsy, and it's a rapidly orodispersible tablet. And so while this isn't really a personalized medicine as such, in that it's not tailored to an individual patient, it does pave the way for the use of 3D printing in personalized medication or personalized medicine. or as some people would say, a more appropriate term is perhaps personalized pharmacy. So perhaps we're not too far away then from a situation where, you know, somebody would get a prescription for their drugs or their suite of drugs, and the pharmacist or the formulator or the manufacturer of the product would design a product for that particular patient. That product would be printed out for the particular patient and delivered to them, perhaps in not necessarily a home setting, but in a compounding pharmacy setting, or in a pharmacy connected to a health center or to a hospital or whatever. And, you know, this plausible future of personalized medicine, does it leave a question mark over the future of the large scale manufacturing of the pharmaceutical sector? I'm not so sure, but, you know, it's not inconceivable that we would see something like this happening in the future. And I think I'll leave it there, but happy to discuss and take questions a little later on.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. And I can say that there's quite a lot of questions coming in at the moment, so that's great. So we're going to move on to our last speaker, who is Professor Stephen Ferguson. And Stephen is also the person who organised today's event and put together all the speakers as well. So thank you to him again for that. So Stephen conducted his undergraduate studies in chemical and bioprocess engineering in UCD, and he completed a PhD in Professor Brian Lennon's research group studying continuous crystallization of drugs as part of the SSPC research cluster. After his PhD, he moved to MIT, where he worked as part of the Novartis MIT Center for Continuous Manufacturing, a $100 million investment by Novartis to transform the manufacturing of medicines under the supervision of Professor Alan Meyerson and Center Director Professor Bernard Trout. He was then recruited to chemical R&D in Biogen, where he led crystallization efforts and contributed to all engineering competencies in the development and commercialization of API processes. He then had the opportunity to develop novel clinical forms for first-in-class drugs in collaboration with pharmaceutical sciences and engage in the development of flow synthesis and continuous manufacturing for technologies for Biogen. And he has now joined us in UCD 3 years ago, I think, Stephen, is that correct? Yes, yeah. Four. Okay, sorry, 4 years ago now, as assistant professor at the UCD School of Chemical and Bioprocess Engineering. So I'll hand over to you now, Stephen.
Thank you very much again. I gave you a challenge with a very long introduction as well, so apologies. So I'll just pop up my slides very quickly on the first presenting slide. So I think that seems to be okay on my screen. That's all right for everybody? That's
perfect. Yes, Stephen. Yeah.
So I'll jump straight into it. So thanks to all the other speakers to set the scene and given a very broad perspective. I'll perhaps be a bit narrower on manufacturing technologies and specifically engineering manufacturing technologies. For many of you, I think callers are involved in the pharmaceutical sector, but pharmaceuticals currently manufacture using a batch operation approach, which involves bringing chemicals and reagents together in a big tank, similar to a big pot, stirring and doing that through multiple steps. And that is the mode that's dominated really since the start of the industry over 100 years ago. Many other industries in the intervening time period have adjusted their paradigm of manufacturing quite considerably, taking up something that's called continuous manufacturing, but also a lot of other innovations around how they structure their businesses. Pharmaceuticals, for a number of reasons, has not switched over to take up intensive manufacturing technologies. One, it operates on a relatively small scale compared to other industries, and also operates with reasonably high profit margins, particularly in the innovator pharma space, whereby the manufacturing costs are small compared to the cost of discovery of new molecules. That said, there's much greatly increased interest in advanced manufacturing in the industry. So there was a number of investments. I think Aoife mentioned one, but there's also been very significant investment by the Irish government through SFI and a number of other funding bodies, developing continuous manufacturing techniques and other advanced manufacturing techniques for pharmaceuticals as one of our largest exporting industries. I guess this makes sense. So this really kicked off and became a movement in about 2005 to 2008. And one of the key cornerstones around that era was to develop continuous manufacturing technologies for pharmaceuticals. The first end-to-end demonstration of this was the so-called Red Line in MIT, where I had the opportunity to work, which was the first fully integrated end-to-end pharmaceutical plant. This is quite a fun place to work, and quite interesting and chaotic at times. Since this demonstration, there's been a number of other commercial applications of this technology in the EU, in Ireland, and actually across a number of manufacturing areas, including the US and Singapore. So this basically takes the technologies that were developed for larger scale commodity chemicals to produce really, really cheap petrol and petrochemicals, which if produced via batch manufacturing would cost many thousands to fill up your car, and try to shrink these down for smart pharmaceutical scales of operation. There's a huge amount of research that's gone into this across all of the technologies needed, from synthetic chemistry, purification operations, formulation operations, and the small molecule pharma space, including digitization and control. When you do the calculations and actually run the chemistry typically used to make pharmaceutical compounds at the limits of what the kinetics for the individual reactions will allow, rather than slowing everything down to allow it to get into big batch vessels, you can get really some remarkable increases in the intensity of production. So the first example here, the MIT Red Line, was regional supply for large parts of the world for a Novartis drug. However, in some cases, you can get very, very large increases in productivity. So one example, rather selfishly, I wanted to give for one of the individual operations, maybe to sort of crystallize this, and you'll have to pardon the pun, would be a mixer I developed in my PhD in Brian Glennon's group, where we looked to really push things and see how productive and how small can we make a crystallizer, which was one of the very problematic operations to transfer to intensive continuous production. So you can see one of the mixers we developed here compared to a 10-cent coin, and here it is when there is crystallization taking place. And this mixer, combined with a small piece of tubing that was disposable and very, very low costs, had the same output as a 10,000 liter reactor run 43 times, which is about a year's production batch suite. So that was just one very concrete example. Within this, there is a huge amount of new innovations, both in the chemistry, formulation, and technology space. That was just maybe one example I would give. And that needs to be brought together and automated to do continuous production or more intensive production. There's been subsequent commercial demonstrations, as I mentioned, but also there has been tabletop production facilities developed, funded by the US Army, also on MIT, and a couple of other miniature manufacturing demos, one of them in the SSPC, conducted in UCD again. Over the past 10 years, whereby we can shrink down the manufacturing footprint of it into a box or a tabletop or a fume hood. So this does raise the possibility of distributed or even personalized manufacturing. There are challenges associated with this from a regulatory point of view, but when you do intensify, you can potentially do this with automation, although the business model has not really been worked out for that yet, although there are many people trying to develop this. There are different challenges with different functions. I think we've been introduced to a few of them. You have chemical synthesis, which is how we make our chemical drugs. I think Niall gave the example of aspirin. So that has a lot of variability in how you conduct the chemistry. The form factors of a lot of the reactors have to be different in continuous manufacturing, whereas a single batch reaction with a batch reactor with chemistry made to fit would be the platform for batch manufacturing, one of the reasons why it's been so dominant in this industry, given the wide variety of products. In other platforms, for example, formulation of drug products and also large molecule pharmaceuticals, the biotherapeutics that were discussed. In this case, the drug products and the drug substances, in the case of biopharmaceuticals, are more complex entities, and in these cases, your products are really a function of your process. So not all of the attributes can be fully measured. And as a result, they tend to gravitate towards platform production, which actually may, even despite the increased complexity of the product, enable a smoother transition to take up advanced manufacturing techniques. I guess the question is, why was this not done years ago, or what is the catch? Well, there is a lower business driver in terms of the manufacturing is a lower fraction of the cost, with R&D being a much higher percentage of the cost in bringing a medicine to market. There's a study out of Tufts a number of years ago that estimated the cost of going through all the R&D and development process was on the order of $2 billion, which ends up with these very high headline prices for drugs, and these are often recouped in the US, Europe, and a number of other markets through high drug prices, which do expire after a set period of between 10 and 20 years, and then they move to very low cost generic manufacturing, where these technologies still haven't been taken up, but may make an impact on the cost basis of the industry. The supply chains in batch allow us to have these really long supply chains, whereby your initial inputs to the process can take several years to go from being the atoms from the downstream industries, the chemical industries and the raw material industries, to being the final drug, and it can be produced across multiple continents. That has allowed drug manufacturing costs to be quite low, particularly for generics. However, in the context of COVID-19, we're seeing that these very long supply chains are fragile, and there are problems that have existed pre-COVID in terms of shortages of certain drugs that are very cheap to manufacture, well understood, but they haven't been possible to supply, or they will stock out on occasions. And this is one of the things that has developed the interest in advanced manufacturing technology. I think from raw materials to product here is in this plant was 2 weeks. In some examples, for example, one nice paper on ibuprofen, it was possible to go from raw materials to final product within 5 minutes end to end for the whole factory. So if you pair that with a very widely available commercial starting material, you definitely have a new paradigm for the industry, which I think will be of interest as different regions look to make their supply chains more concentrated and more robust, although that is an ongoing development. So many of the technologies for this advanced processing in small molecule have been developed, they've been adapted, they're starting to be commercialized, but what's next in the research space? So increasing digitization, where we can do the development purely computationally, and these go from building multi-scale models that engineers have typically developed with, to using AI to actually replicate the thought process of chemists that usually goes in to recommend synthetic routes for the development of drugs, increasing use of robotics, and something that I was going to pop up some pictures, but it is possible to 3D print a lot of the chemical equipment now. So this is nascent and something that we're working on in UCD, and in other centers there is research in this area as well. We're doing it in collaboration with the iForm Center, in addition to our work that has been previously mentioned in the SSPC. We just developed the first peak printed reactor, which is a plastic printed reactor that's chemically compatible, which can go up to 100 bar of pressure and actually take on the really aggressive chemistries that allow us to have these really short raw materials to final product time scales. One thing that is needed, the change of mindset in the industry. So typically an engineering type approach hasn't really taken place. There's an increased information burden required to develop these intensified processes and stick them all together. So this requires more computation, different training, and also people that have mixed skills between science and engineering as well. And we've kind of developed programs, particularly at the research level, to try and fill that gap in Ireland. This presents opportunities and challenges for the Irish economy. I think the first actual commercial clinical trial manufacturing campaign in Europe for continuous processing was by Lilly in Cork. The investments have a lower capital footprint, and they do have a lower number of total jobs, but those jobs will be of a much higher training level, salary and such. So this is an opportunity for Ireland on a threat. We do export a lot. We do need to keep on top of manufacturing technology. However, it may be an opportunity to bring in more of the value chain into Ireland, where we currently can't compete because of high labor costs. We can do this with increased automation and intensifies manufacturing. It also reduces the economic footprint as well. But as I mentioned, if you can print a factory, which is something we're working on currently in UCD, And you can also ship it anywhere in the world. There is this distributed medicines paradigm that may be a challenge for a global hub like Ireland in the sort of medium to long term. Biopharmaceuticals have a slightly different problem set to Ireland, and I think I've probably gone over my time at this point. There is actually a lack of capacity in this industry. There is the need to produce a lot more MABs, and it moves into wider patient populations from small-scale immunology and after that oncology applications. In Biogen, we were working on first effective treatment for Alzheimer's, where it's talking about tens and tens of metric tons of antibody, which is obviously going to be a challenge. In this space, maybe just to sum up very briefly, cell engineering used to be the bottleneck. So to coax genetically engineered cells to produce the recombinant proteins used to only happen at very low concentrations and relatively low productivities. This is increased by orders and orders of magnitude. So this has pushed the bottleneck in manufacturing downstream. As a result, the sort of advanced manufacturing approaches I mentioned that have been invested in for small molecule pharmaceuticals have also been developed for large molecule pharmaceuticals, and starting to see some penetration with somewhat of a lag. And these are getting into sort of new engineering equipment and approaches that will be familiar to people that have worked in this space. There is the potential for much faster rollout, and I think that is something that would be, people can see the value in this now. So a 5-year rollout of a bioplant can be brought down using things like disposables, but also smaller capex at less risk could allow more productivity to be rolled out faster using advanced manufacturing technologies. The next generation are going to bring their own challenges. In some cases, they'll be more complex. In some cases, they won't. So maybe I'll leave you with 2 examples just pulled off the web here. The Regeneron drug, I think there's part of it is being trialed for production in Limerick right now. That is a treatment for coronavirus and was given to Trump. It had an 8-gram dose, which is enormous for a single patient if you went historically in antibody doses. How would we roll this out really, really quickly to the whole world if we need to? And I think advanced manufacturing technologies do allow this to be done using far higher productivity equipment. Also, the Pfizer and BioNTech vaccine is looking to roll out 1.3 billion doses by the end of 2021. This is the next generation of vaccine based on mRNA, and this has actually become simpler than the large molecule therapeutics, and there's potential to do semi-synthetic or synthetic routes using enzymes to manufacture this in a very rapid way, which is what is one of the things facilitating this rollout for COVID and hopefully all future pandemics. So I apologize, I went over there, so I will stop talking.
Thanks, Stephen. You ended on quite a negative note about there being future pandemics. Please don't. Okay, so I'm going to ask all the panelists to switch on their cameras again, because we have quite a few questions coming in, and I'll start to read through these, and I'll give the name of the person who's asked the question, and then I will direct it at a particular panelist if it is. Some of the questions are directed at all panelists. So the very first one is from PJ Rutten, and PJ was president of the EGA before, as many of you know, and his question is, what's your best guess on realization, testing and regulatory approval of COVID-19 vaccines? And PJ's asking that of anyone on the panel who feels brave enough to try to give an answer there.
Well, the latest I think I saw was that there's 10 vaccines, I think, at various stages in the clinic. So they'd be probably phase 3. There's some, I mean, there was reference to the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. I think there's one AstraZeneca, Moderna. So they say that you could possibly have clinical approval by year end. If you're an optimist, maybe Q1 next year. Then you have to get, then you have to work out how you make and supply it. So depending on how they prioritize who gets the vaccine, you could see vaccines rolling out next year at some stage, I'd imagine, but I'm not an expert and I'm only guessing. And as you well know, lots can happen at phase 3 in the pharmaceutical industry. You can lose the product, but it's remarkable how quickly they've actually managed to bring it to this stage, to be honest with you. And there's been quite a lot of collaboration within the industry, which is not normal in the pharmaceutical industry, but it's been good to see. And interesting, you've also seen these big pharma and high tech companies collaborating. The Pfizer, BioNTech being a good example of that, and obviously Moderna would come from that biotech or high tech field as well. The other thing I suppose to remember, and this is reference to our friend President Trump, they are looking at monoclonal antibody as being, I suppose, a therapeutic for it. And then you obviously also have the various antivirals which are out there as well. So I think really with COVID-19, it's a question of coming up with a strategy which can protect the vulnerable part of society, whom are the over 65s. And if you can manage that and it's effective and it can be quick, you probably can mitigate a lot of the nastier impacts of this, such as death and serious illness and overcrowding of hospitals, obviously, and overloading of hospitals. So that's, I think I remember listening to Luke O'Neill on RTE saying it's like having 50 footballers on the pitch. One of them is bound to put the ball in the net eventually. So if you're an optimist, you'll follow Luke.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Don't know if anyone else wants to jump in there, or are you happy with that answer? Any of you less optimistic, more optimistic? Stephen, you look like you're about to say something.
I was just going to say, you know, one of the really important things, while everybody's very, very anxious to get a vaccine for obvious reasons, it would be catastrophic if something was approved that turned out to be, you know, have higher side effects than would normally be allowed, because not only would it damage COVID-19 future vaccinations, it would have a huge negative impact on all vaccinations for the future. So, of course, you know, they have to be very measured in terms of rolling these out, going through proper regulatory testing and so on.
Yeah. They're huge clinical trials though as well. I mean, they're 30,000 to 60,000 on the trials. So we have to live in hope.
Okay. I'm going to move on to our next question, which is from Kevin Smith of IPS Consulting Engineers, and he's put it directly to you, Matt, but maybe others might have an answer on this as well. So he says there's a significant shortage of experienced biochemical engineers in Ireland to support the biopharma industry. Are there any plans to increase the number of university places in UCD, UCC, CIT, etc.?
You're asking the wrong person.
Yes, I was going to say it might not be. It might be to
I hope so.
One of our
we'd be very happy to hear if they are increasing the number of places.
Maybe
I mean,
I mean, I can speak again from the Atmp perspective. That white paper I mentioned that we published last year, part of one of the strategies within that is the education and training piece. NIBRT are front and center in that space, obviously, again, for the biopharma and future Atmp space. And yes is the answer. We are lobbying all the HEIs to look at this as an opportunity to expand existing programs, to think about new programs that will put out the right type of operators all the way from kind of post-leaving cert right through to PhD and beyond, to make sure that, you know, because the first question on every company's lips when they look at Ireland as a potential place to come to is, where will we get the people?
So I think, I might be able to add something to this as well, is that in stage 1 engineering this year, we've increased the number of places quite significantly by 50 places, which is from 300 to 350 in first year. So obviously we don't know if all of those will go on and do chemical engineering, but we have a much bigger cohort of engineers coming into stage 1, which hopefully means that we'll have bigger cohorts going on into chemical engineering. And I know the School of Chemical and Bioprocess Engineering here in UCD have, as part of their strategic plans, big ambitions to grow your numbers beyond what they would have been traditionally, because you recognise that increased pressure in the marketplace.
Yeah, and I mean, talent as a general issue is a priority for us in Biopharmachem Ireland. Availability of people. The expert group on future skills needs produced a report on the biopharma sector about 4 years ago now, and in our view, and the message we're giving to government at the moment is that needs to be reviewed. And Niall is right, as we move into the newer areas of therapeutics, there's a whole new skill set required, which may not be available globally even yet at the moment.
Maybe there's a final thought on that. We have in UCD Chemical and Bioprocess Engineering developed a couple of master's programs. So there is an MNJC in biopharmaceutical engineering. We've allowed the core undergrad cohort as well to do biochemical minor as part of their studies. And there is also now a part-time master's degree for biopharmaceutical engineering as well. Who can take on primarily on Fridays. And that would be a way a lot of people have looked to switch over their skill set from chemical industry processing to biopharmaceuticals.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. There's a couple of comments coming through about making slides available afterwards. We're recording this session, so I think it's going to be on the EGA website afterwards, and we can look at how we can make slides available to people afterwards. But there's obviously a lot of interest in the presentations that have been here today. So we have a question now from Alexander Buckley, who's asking if any of the panelists could speak to the future of biotech in Ireland beyond manufacturing and formulation associated with big pharma. Specifically, how do they see innovation and the new venture landscape evolving?
Do you want, I can throw an idea in. We've in Biopharmaceuticals Ireland, we're starting to concentrate our efforts on what we would call indigenous biotech. And we do see the emergence of a number of companies in that space. And it would be a priority for us now. We've been very successful in attracting a lot of FTI, but we do need to turn our attention towards supporting local industry. And we have been working with Enterprise Ireland and with some of the locally based VC companies to see can we identify ways to support and help local industry, because I think it's very important to have a complete industrial cluster. It cannot just be based purely on multinationals. You need to have strong local companies as well. And I think with the newer advanced therapeutics, you're going to need that, because you're going to need those skill sets to support any kind of industrial base. So I think it should be a priority.
I think there's some recognition as well. I mean, government launched a couple of years ago the Disruptive Technologies Innovation Fund, which is designed, as the name suggests, to kind of catapult smaller companies into the market a little bit quicker by engaging with the research infrastructure within the HEIs and so on. So if you look at the list of companies that have been funded by that, there are several small companies that Matt just referred to who have got significant funding to help bring through those innovations. And again, in Ireland, we have a fantastic history of drug delivery. You know, companies like Elan back in the day, and there's been a lot of innovation that have come from individuals who kind of spun out from I guess the demise of Elan. But so there is, the short answer is that there is a lot of innovation in that area and quite a bit of support going into it.
Okay. So we have a question for Stephen specifically this time. So it says continuous, this is from Kevin Smith again, continuous formulation. Okay, and I'm not a chemical engineer, so I may not be pronouncing this correctly, Stephen. Lyophilization in a sterile drug product manufacturing facility seems to be the future. Currently, there are batch processes. These are batch processes and very time consuming. What have you seen in that sector?
Sure. So I guess I think Anne-Marie could speak to this probably even better than me, since he's asked it. So there are other ways. So lyophilization is a key for particularly drugs that have a lack of stability, but oftentimes drugs are now just frozen and shipped in frozen liquor, and then filled directly into, say, auto injectors, which are becoming more common. The other thing that would be potential innovation is just spray drying. So taking a technology that's used to make food and small molecule pharmaceuticals, and rather than lyophilizing, rapidly evaporating the water in the case of biopharmaceuticals within a fraction of a second and collecting it continuously or with a cyclone. So that would be at very high level a couple of technologies that are there. And this is the focus of a lot of research from the fundamentals up into the manufacturing technology scales.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I guess it has always surprised me that the sector hasn't really embraced spray drying as a potential alternative to freeze drying for biopharmaceutical processing. But I guess, lyophilization, freeze drying is such a well-established process and such a controlled process And even though it is a batch process and takes such a long time, it is a well-known process and produces the results that's required. So, but yeah, I mean, there's potential there to, as Stephen has said, you know, embrace what other industries have embraced in terms of alternative processes like spray drying, but there seems to be a reluctance to move.
Yeah, I think Emily sent a message to us there saying, can spray drying damage to delicate APIs? I think the answer is in some cases, and stabilization efforts are possible. But I think that's you know, definitely something that can be overcome in many cases with more research.
So another question for Anne-Marie actually now. Thinking of a future scenario of a 3D printed medication in a pharmacy setting, would you like to speculate what might the optimum presentation of the API to such a setup look like? And that's from Michael Napier.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that there has been a resurgence, particularly in the States, of what are called compounding pharmacies, you know, where we're going back to the producing a single bottle or a single pill for a single patient. But the reality is that the regulatory burden is going to be so high that I don't think we're going to see a case where the pharmacy is going to start off with an API powder and end up with a tablet for a particular patient. So I think what's more likely to happen is that there'll be a partnering, if you like, of the traditional pharmaceutical industry with the compounding pharmacies or with the digital pharmacies, where the industry will provide maybe the filaments, the drug-loaded filaments, so extradates, you know, with the drug loaded into the polymer. And then the pharmacy will take different filaments depending on the need of the patient and print the tablet with one API or a combination of APIs from these preloaded polymer filaments, using something like fused deposition modeling, which seems to be for solid dosage forms the main technology that has, at least in the research field, been examined. So to my mind, that's where I see it happening. So maybe, you know, there'll be a range of different filaments with different types of release profiles, different drugs, different drug loadings, different concentrations, and then in the pharmacy they'll select a range of filaments depending on the particular need of the patient.
Okay, thanks, Anne-Marie. So Niall, we have a question for you as well now from Niamh O'Connell, and it's about postgrad opportunities in Ireland for students wanting to explore the Atmp manufacturing industry. And her question about, is there a lack of postgrad opportunities in that area?
I mean, I'll say selfishly there is, and again, I'll harken back to the work we're trying to do in terms of lobbying for this, attention being paid to this area by government. We'll certainly be working hard to convince the funding agencies in Ireland that there should be more opportunities for funding in the manufacturing of these modalities, and that's something we will work on over the coming months and years. But there are opportunities there. Certainly, you know, in NIBRT there are several people working on it. You know, Niamh can get in touch with me afterwards if she's interested, but there are several labs around the country with PIs who have been focusing on this space for a while. So I'd like to see more, and hopefully they will come in future again, because these people will be needed to seed that industry here in Ireland if it comes.
If I can just add and give a plug to the school in Trinity. So we're currently recruiting for a chair in Pharmaceutical Biology, which is a bit of a funny title, but the idea is to get somebody with expertise in this Atmp space, not necessarily in the manufacturing side of things, which is more NIBRT's remit, but this is funded through a bequest actually from Don Panos, who was formerly the founder of Elan Pharmaceuticals that Niall mentioned earlier. And as part of this bequest to the school, we're also putting in place a PhD program to enable us to fund more PhD students in the pharmaceutical sciences generally, but hopefully some of them will be aligned to this Atmp area as well.
Okay, got a couple of, sorry Stephen, go ahead.
Maybe just add to that as well. I think Anne-Marie leads the CDT, the Centre for Doctoral Training in Transformative Pharmaceutical Technologies. I lead the cohort in UCD. And this is a combined graduate school between ourselves, CIT, Trinity, and UCL in London and University of Nottingham. And there will certainly be at least some opportunities within that cohort in the Atmp space.
And those PhD studentships will be advertised probably in November or December. So keep an eye out.
Me and anyone else who is looking at PhDs in that area. We've got a couple of questions and comments around COVID. So Conor O'Neill from Pfizer put in a comment which relates to PJ's question earlier on about how quickly vaccine might be available. So he said that they plan on submitting for FDA emergency use authorization at the end of this month, October, and they plan to manufacture 200 million doses this year. So I presume that's in 2020. And Pfizer Dublin will do the release testing for the EU drug product. So it's not a question, but it's an interesting comment that relates to one of the earlier questions. I'm very positive, obviously, there. From Kevin Smith, again, we have a question about, which relates somewhat to COVID in terms of drug shortages and what the impact of big biopharma moving their mass production to COVID-19 vaccines, how that might impact upon drug shortages over the next 5 years. And he's again said that open to any of the speakers if you think you feel like answering that.
Interesting that Regeneron, actually, their new investment is to take up slack from a COVID-19 manufacturer in the States. It really depends on what part of the business you're in as well. I mean, vaccine manufacture is quite specialized. So you can't necessarily turn a plant on to make vaccines if it's not built to make vaccines. So there's where we did see an issue with shortages recently resulting from COVID-19 was supply chain problems. And we did see, especially in the generic part of the industry, we did see a number of raw materials becoming unavailable because they were manufactured outside the European Union. Big example was paracetamol, where the active was being manufactured in India, and they basically closed their borders and there was no active for paracetamol. And the intermediate actually was sourced in China, so it was quite a lengthy supply chain. So a consequence of this has been the European Commission looking to reshore some manufacturing. And there is activity, there is a pharmaceutical roadmap being constructed by the European Commission at the moment. And in there will be a priority given to more manufacture of APIs, especially within the European Union. And no, not all APIs, because cost is still a major issue. But you could see some reshoring of manufacturing take place. And it really, I think it highlighted the delicacy of some of the supply chains in the pharmaceutical industry. They can be quite extensive and they can cover quite a distance. So the importance of these being robust, I think, has been, brought to light by the pandemic. So security of supply could be an issue in the future. And this could be an opportunity for Ireland, as we're a major manufacturer. But we do know also that, say, France, for instance, have invested, I think, €1 billion in API manufacture, which would be unusual. So you could see a slight changing face.
Okay, so we've got a question from Kevin Boyle, who's listening to this with his daughter who's in transition year, and he's wondering what kind of courses she should do in university to encourage her, I think, to probably do chemical engineering. So I'm going to do a shameless plug for UCD Engineering, Kevin, and say your daughter should definitely come here in first year, and we can look after her very well. And my own son is in transition year and is also listening today about this, so I'm trying to encourage him to come here as well. So definitely we can look after her here if she wants to do engineering, and we always have open days, etc. So I'd encourage her to come and listen to the November 14th open day about engineering as well. So I'll stop the plug there and we'll move on to some of the other questions. For Niall, the cost of, this is from Paul Malone, the cost of manufacturing cell therapies is very high and margins are lower than for small or large molecules. Is there an opportunity for Irish R&D to develop technologies to reduce cost of manufacturing?
I mean, the short answer is I think there is. I mean, the reason these modalities are so expensive is because in many ways they're new. The early elements of any new technology are always going to be more expensive, and there's a lot of people trying a lot of different platforms and approaches to making them, and as time goes on, you know, certain platforms will come to the fore, and you'll probably hopefully see prices go down. As for innovation around that space, we already have companies doing that with small companies like Avectus that were spun out from Maynooth, who have a very novel technology for introducing. I mentioned the example of a lentivirus being used to get the DNA or the RNA payload into a cell. They have a technology that mitigates the need for a virus and the manufacturing of a virus that I mentioned that needs to be done, where you can actually use a device to do that. So there's examples of that already, and I think, you know, as a small nation, it's really important that we do innovate and keep the value high in Ireland, and not try to compete with very low base manufacturing jurisdictions around the world. So yeah, I think we do have the mindset to do that. And again, that links into the education piece. We need to make sure we have transition year students listening, so that in 10 years time they're or less are ready to jump in with their great ideas to solve some of these problems.
Then we can move to a question from Brian Lennon, who's from UCD, but also from APC, an Irish company in this area, which probably relates somewhat a little bit to what you were saying, Niall, about innovation in Irish companies in the chemical engineering area. So Brian has a question for Matt, he says, but if any panelist wants to jump in, does the move to highly personalised innovative medicine put Ireland's focus on large-scale manufacturing excellence at risk?
Well, sure. I mean, is he referring to personalized medicines now, or just the I suppose manufacturing becoming more mobile? I know APC themselves are doing a lot of work in that field and doing a great job as well. Sure. As manufacturing, especially continuous rigs and small rigs, and they can be moved around the world, and Ireland as a hub needs to pay attention to this and ensure that our offering for the industry is second to none in terms of, I suppose, attracting and keeping companies here. The other area that I suppose we can look at to mitigate that is trying to get control of supply chains, or the head of the supply chain, and try and locate as much control over the supply chain in Ireland through the establishment of control towers, global business services, better manufacturing. The one thing, though, I would say that the mega plants which are in the ground will be there for some time because they're significant capital investment. But single-use technologies, advanced manufacturing, we need to be playing in that space, and I suppose be better at it than anyone else in the world. And if we are, we'll hold it. If we're not, we won't.
Okay. So we have a question from Parth Nick for Stephen, and he wants to know, what is the scope of continuous manufacturing of biopharmaceuticals in coming years, and what would be major engineering challenges in your opinion?
Okay, well, I'll say hello to Parth, one of my former students as well, so thank you for the question. So in terms of continuous biomanufacturing, it would be, so there's a few things to this. In many ways, a lot of the problems around having so many different types of technologies needed for the chemical processes are removed, in that there's relatively standardized platforms that are typically bioreactor, isolation of protein of cells, and then downstream purification, which is typically a series of chromatography columns and membranes. So these can all be transitioned over to continuous manufacturing if needed. The main thing is the capacity of the industry. So I would say the technology is there. There is specific challenges for each of the different modalities, but by and large they are surmountable. And so they do provide a roadmap to scale as industry goes up in terms of what's needed. So typically you've gone from very, very small applications, maybe a few kilos a year, up to tens of tons for some applications. This is in the case of drugs, where you can sell things for quite a high price. However, there may be applications outside of the pharmaceutical sector where we have these highly engineered proteins that can do other functions. They would need very large amounts of protein to be produced. There is a kind of a blip in that the platforms in terms of downstream chromatography and membranes, they may stop, they may not have the scalability at the cost price that we would want when we reach a certain point, but that is out into the long term rather than even the medium term, sort of 20-year time frame.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions related to the same issue about how AI can be used in the pharmaceutical industry, and that comes from both Rory O'Brien and Muthu Kumar Sampath have asked the same question. So what role do you see for AI or deep learning in the pharmaceutical industry and in operating processes?
Does that come to...
For anyone, it's for anyone. He hasn't, neither of them have named a particular person.
I think that's an engineering question, Stephen.
Okay.
So maybe we'll start. So AI is a general technology. So it's like, you know, in some ways it's like in previous eras, you know, how will computers help, you know, contribute to drug manufacturing and the pharmaceutical industry? And the answer is in all facets. So maybe I'll give some shameless plugs to people I know and stuff that's close to my heart, but that's in no means representative. So at maybe the lowest level, when I was getting into engineering, one of my compatriots who actually works in APC, an Irish company, and my colleague Jessica Whelan, who's now back in UCD, developed statistical control of bioreactors. They used a few different varieties. So these are things that have been common in engineering for a while, but have entered the sort of business language and neural nets and the like that use not predefined mechanical rules like we would know in Newton's laws, but conceptual statistical black boxes to do control. An area that's really popular in pharmaceuticals is determination of the crystal structure for your final drug in small molecules. That has been something that's been sort of immune to computational approaches for a long time. It's very intensive. There are a couple of companies. One is sitting out of UCD, and my colleague Niall Barron Niall English is very interested in this area, but also former colleagues from MIT have spun out a company that just did a funding round that they raised, I think, 300 million, where they've taken AI approaches and applied it to that problem. In terms of drug discovery, biological systems are incredibly complex. Drugs try and go in and in a very targeted way manipulate a pathway or something occurring in your body. This is something that if you apply just physics or chemistry to in a computer, it's going to invariably break that computer, apart from some examples. Well, there are some mechanistic examples, but there is a wide variety of AI approaches that would enable to develop insight into mechanisms and cellular pathways in terms of discovery. And I think one example I gave in my talk that was published last year, there's a Polish company and also a research group in MIT that have looked at using AI to sort of absorb the chemistry literature and make predictions of the synthetic route that you would use to go and manufacture a drug that can be made by synthetic chemistry, and then deploy that using robotics or 3D printed technologies that could also be automated and controlled via neural nets and AI. So it's too broad to answer more specifically. I don't really want to go down any more rabbit holes, so I'll take it on.
So we've got a point made by Ray Knox. It's not a question, but it's just saying that there are routes into pharma through other engineering pathways, not just chemical engineering. So he's a mechanical engineering graduate from UCD, and obviously there are routes into it from there as well. There's a comment from Kevin Smith, an invitation from Kevin Smith, saying that the PDA Ireland affiliate are organising a virtual conference on disruptive technologies in November, at which Luke O'Neill is speaking, and he would be very happy if any of the speakers would like to speak at that as well. So maybe you can get in contact with him.
He's snaffled me for a conference next week already, the PDA.
Okay.
On ATMPs.
Kevin has a couple of other questions as well. There's a move in some countries such as Switzerland away from SU technology due to its perceived carbon footprint and back to SS, and he just wonders what the panel's thoughts are. Again, not directed at any particular panel member.
Oh, because it's a plastic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess that I don't have a huge amount of insight into this, but I mean, the Amgen built a facility in Singapore not too many years ago that's fully single use, and I've only seen some talks on it, but if you add up all the other things that you lose from a traditional plant, such as clean in place, detergents, the amount of water that's used to disinfect the plant for the next run, and balance that against the single use in a factory that has maybe 8 times smaller footprint, uses less water, less liquid waste, and so on. If you do the kind of the calculation on that, it's probably in a better place than a traditional plant in terms of environmental impact.
And Kevin asks another question about cold chain distribution. Seems to be challenging for many of the COVID-19 vaccines in development. Lyophilization takes time to develop. How can we get it to the poorer countries? And he suggests drones may be an option. Again, that is a question to the panel.
Drones. Yeah, drones have been, I think they've been tested in third world countries, drones to bring drugs. I heard some time ago, a very interesting presentation from, I think it was from Merck, from MSD, where they were sort of trying to think outside the box. And what they were doing was using the technology which is used in minibars in hotels to hold and store vaccines and keep them cold. And they actually outsource the supply of the vaccine to the company who would normally supply a minibar. And that way you always had the right amount, and it was at the right temperature, because use of drugs generally is an issue in the third world, because the climate's difficult, and often they're prescribed the medicine and then they have to purchase the medicine and have it used immediately. So, but yeah, I mean, it's
an
a
interesting
challenge.
idea.
Well, I think maybe just to add to that, I mean, I think the richer countries tend to subsidize the R&D, and the manufacturing costs aren't really critical for supply in richer countries. But this does become a big barrier when you go to poorer countries, and it is definitely in forefront of a lot of people's thinking. And I think there's a lot of academics, foundations that are looking towards this. And I think, interestingly, on the cold chain and supply chain, I think I did see an interview several years ago where they had been talking to Coca-Cola about helping distribute vaccines, as it can often be impossible to get a vaccine into a location, but if you go there, you can just buy a Coke. So this is maybe a trivial example. Yeah. There is supply chain innovations and other things that are not technical that would make a huge difference for that problem.
Okay, so a question from Patrick Kinsler. Going to the front end, what is the practical limit for continuous biofermentation? All current products use batch fermentations with the cell line replaced after a few generations. He hasn't named anyone in particular to answer that question, but I'm guessing it's probably Niall or... Yeah.
I'd maybe take a pop at it, which, I mean, I assume you're talking about mammalian cell lines as opposed to bacteria, but if you are, I guess, perfusion culture has been around for many years, typically, runs of what you'd call continuous production for maybe up to 60 or possibly 90 days, depending on the process. But you're right, cell generation is an issue. You have the cells characteristics will change over time in culture. So continuous as in, for years on end is unlikely, but perfusion culture is very much something that is an older technology that's come back to the fore again, but probably not more than 2 to 3 months in terms of a continuous process that has to be stopped and restarted.
Okay.
Just to add to that, maybe the bigger concern, I think that's been demonstrated. I think there is changes, but they are, by the people who research this stuff, they said they think it's manageable. But actually, the bigger concern may be maintaining sterility for like 1/3 of a year or potentially longer would perhaps be a bigger worry. I think people are happier if they can shut down more often than the limit of the genome and the cells will allow to clean and start back up again.
Okay. So the question, I think, is probably aimed at Anne-Marie about postdoc positions in pharmaceutical sciences. Are they also coming up and available?
Well, I will hopefully be advertising for a postdoc position before the end of the year. I'm negotiating with a company to co-fund a postdoc position through the SSPC. So it's with the lawyers at the moment.
Okay,
I'll be looking
hopefully there's a potential candidate sitting here in the audience. Okay.
So I'll be looking for somebody with formulation and processing experience.
Okay, thanks, Emery. From Cathal Nulty for Niall, he says, is there a risk that companies won't be incentivized to manufacture cures through Atmps rather than ongoing treatments?
I don't think so. I mean, really, ultimately, I guess what that will come down to is pricing, which is obviously is a science, a huge science in its own right. Is how do you price a drug? I mean, Stephen mentioned earlier, you know, the vast resources that go into the R&D step, and the manufacturing isn't necessarily a huge impact on the bottom line. But you know, for these cures, I guess it's yet to be seen whether they all will be. There's some really promising results out there, as I mentioned. That, you know, you've probably seen the headlines in the papers, such and such new gene therapy will cost over $2 million per dose. But if you do the economics of less time in hospital beds, less medicines over a lifetime of someone who's perhaps injecting a replacement therapy for many years of their life, the impact on quality of life, all those different elements when they come together can perhaps be accounted for. But so the incentive ultimately, I guess, for companies at the end of the day is to be economically viable and profit making. So it'll come down to, I think, cost of drugs, cost of the drug for the patient, as opposed to disincentivizing just because it's a cure.
Okay, so we're coming down to our last couple of questions. One of them is about job prospects in Ireland in the area. I think probably you've all answered this already, that you feel it's very, very positive, but if you want to comment on it further, please do. Maybe.
Yes, I mean, excuse me, the industry is growing at the moment. So there are opportunities across the board. There's been a lot of new investment, so there would be opportunities, certainly. And we encourage people to look to work in the industry. It's a very good employer, especially for engineers and for scientists.
Okay. And our last question is really probably a question for, it says for Anne-Marie, but I think it's for all the academics here. It's not really chemical engineering related. It's more, what's the university experience like for students nowadays that everything's virtual?
Oh,
and when do we plan to go back face to face?
House parties.
Well, I think we're going to be virtual for a while, but hopefully, I think that's what we'd all hope. And I'm sure Anne-Marie's, Trinity are the same. We all hope that we can be back face to face. And development of a vaccine is one of those things that could help us. Sorry, Anne-Marie, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think it can only be a horrible experience for students. Not a horrible experience, but certainly not what one would hope for, you know.
No.
I have traditional experience.
I have two boys myself, one in Trinity, one in UCD.
It feels sorry for them.
And it's all online. I mean, we're doing what we can, and I think it's probably the same in engineering. You know, there's a practical element that you have to do, and so we're doing as much as we can face to face for the practical element. We haven't yet prepared for next semester because we're still holding out a slight hope that we might be able to do more face to face, but it's not looking good.
No, and I think it's the same in UCD. We're doing everything we can to bring them in for practicals. Academically, I think students will still meet everything they need to meet the learning objectives. For me, I think it's the social side and those interactions and networking that they're really losing out on this year. And that's the main reason we hope to get them back as soon as we possibly can. But we don't know when at this stage. So those were all of the questions that we received quite a lot of questions in the end. I can see our attendees are beginning to drift off at this point, but I think it's been a very successful evening. So thank you to all the panelists again for taking time out to do this for us. We're really grateful to you. And thank you also to our attendees for coming along. At one point, I think we had 100 attendees listening in. So that's very successful. More than we usually get at a physical EGA event. So we should look at this again in the future possibly, but I hope everybody really enjoyed it. We are going to be making the presentation available. I will talk to people in UCD about how we can make those slides available, and please do keep in contact with us afterwards. We hope to have another event in the springtime, another EGA event as well, physically if we can, but otherwise like this again. So thank you everybody for coming along this evening.